Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here once again, and I wanted to start off today before I begin with talking about Lecha Dodi, just with a couple of comments about the period in the Jewish calendar that we find ourselves in. We're in the beginning of a section of the year called Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer, in which we count down, as it were, counting the days in which God descends from on high down to Mount Sinai to give the Torah at Shavuot. There is a tradition, a legend, or and perhaps historical, that during this period of the Omer, of the counting of the Omer, thousands of students of Rabbi Akiva's died from a plague. We find ourselves in a similar situation where hopefully we are now beginning to emerge, although my mom's in Canada, where they're still suffering from big numbers of infections. But the reason that's ascribed for this death, for this plague, was that students were not giving enough respect to each other, not giving enough honor to each other. And while the Kabbalistic coordinates for today are Gvura Shebahod, which means the might or the rigor that's within beauty. And the way that is commonly understood is a kind of a double-fisted adherence to rules and to judgment and to being tough about things. It's also perhaps a call for self-examination and being rigorous with oneself. And I learned something this morning that made me realize that I had been judging a whole group of people. So I'm not going to talk about who that group of people was or what I was judging them about, but just to note that, you know, this is a time in the Omer for us to check in and to sort of see, like, okay, where are we being too harsh, either on ourselves or on others? And on in just a few days will be Lag BaOmer, the day in which tradition says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, according to Kabbalistic traditions, is the author of the Zohar, the central and canonical text of Jewish mysticism. And his death is celebrated. His Yortzeit is celebrated. And the reason for that is that when a tzaddik, when a righteous person dies, according to the Kabbalah, there's a way in which it's understood as a channel being opened up. In the same way that under a chuppah, that the bride and the groom, or the two partners that are standing under a chuppah, that their prayers are traditionally understood as being more readily accepted, that there's a special channel that's opening up. So between on the one hand, the rigor that we should be applying, and then looking forward to this opening of graciousness, we can now turn to today's hymn of Lecha Dodi. And Julie, if you've got that PowerPoint, let me just see if I can, I'm having trouble here. Oh, there we go. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Let's see if I can now share screen. Okay, I'm having some difficulties. So Julie, if you've got it, yeah, if you can pull it up, and then I'll just tell you when to advance it. So the hymn Lecha Dodi is perhaps I'm certain, is the best known piece of Kabbalah in the entire tradition. Within if you could put that into the slideshow mode, that would be great. Perfect. Okay, and within about 25 or 30 years of this hymn being published, and that happened in 1584, almost the entire Jewish world was singing it. Okay, so try to imagine, there's no internet, there's no postal service, there there isn't even really a pony express to get around from one place to the other, or perhaps that's what it is. Some places a pony express, some places a camel express. And within about 30 years, the whole world is singing this song. And there were earlier versions of this song that we're going to, that we will not be talking about today. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about the Kabbalistic meaning of this song. And I've titled it, my talk, the Kabbalistic Pshat of Lecha Dodi. The word Pshat means the plain meaning or the simple meaning of a hymn. And yet Kabbalistic is the esoteric meaning. And the reason is that you can't actually understand this song without understanding the Kabbalistic background that underlies it. So if we can move ahead to the next slide. Okay, great. So what I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes by way of introduction is a little bit of the history before this hymn comes into the world. The hymn is written by Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, who lives in Tzfat in the 16th century. And Tzfat, for about one generation, maybe 1.5 generations, is the host to one of the richest collections of Kabbalists and pietists and halachists that the Jewish world had ever seen. Pause for 1 second. I've got some service people that are outside and they're painting, they're making a lot of noise. I'm just gonna ask them to tone it down. Just 1 second. Guys, I'm giving a lecture in here to hundreds of people. If you could just Okay, great. I told him that there were thousands of people out there in the chat, and so he's toned it down a bit. Just a very quick review of some of the key figures that were here at this time is number one is Rav Yosef Karo, who's perhaps the best known exoteric person, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, of the Code of Jewish Law, and of many other works. But what is less well known is that Rav Yosef Karo was also a mystic. Rav Yosef Karo performed an exorcism. Rav Yosef Karo had nightly visits, nightly encounters with an angel whom he called a Magid, or perhaps even a Shekhinah itself. And the way in which he had those encounters is that he would go into a kind of a trance, and then he would carry on a dialogue with this very moralistic voice that actually spoke through his own vocal cords. So there would be two different voices that would be taking place there. And I see somebody trying to take a screenshot. Is that Julie will send the PowerPoint to everybody, subsequently, so you don't need to worry about it. So here was Rav Yosef Karo carrying on this dialogue and asking about how he should conduct his life. The next most important person is Rav Moshe Cordovero, lives from 1522 to 1570. And he was grand theoretician of Kabbalah, but his personal experience comes out as well in his commentary on the Zohar and other works as well. The next person that I want to refer to is Yitzchak Luria, who commonly known as the Arizal, the most famous Kabbalist of the 16th century, and to a certain extent, the most famous Kabbalist in all of history, hugely influential, creates new systems of Kabbalah. He's a visionary. He talks to the animals. He perceives the psychic life in all things. He looks at people's foreheads and sees verses, sees words written upon their foreheads with letters broken, and is able, as a result, to be able to determine who that person is a reincarnation of whom, which mitzvot, which commandments they fulfilled, which commandments they are particularly required to fulfill in this particular incarnation that they find themselves in. And the last, lest you think, well, this sounds pretty nutty, is you've got some of the smartest people in 16th century Kabbalah who are giving credence to this. And to a certain extent, what that indicates is that there's just different kinds of psychic realities that accompany every age that we live in. There are certain aspects of reality today, of cultural reality, that in a previous generation, people would say were nuts. Even the fact that we have women rabbis, right? 100 years ago, people would say, this is impossible. And yet, of course, this is possible, and it's a very, almost universally or very widely accepted fact of Jewish life today. Lastly, our author, Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, lives from 1500 to 1576. He's the teacher and brother-in-law of Moshe Cordovero, number 2 up ahead, and best known as author of Lecha Dodi, but he also wrote other important Kabbalistic works. Julie, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So here is the chorus of our song. Lecha Dodi likrat kala, pnei Shabbat nekabla. Come, my beloved friend, to greet the bride. Let us welcome the presence of the Sabbath. So the key questions that we need to answer and that we're going to be answering today are: who is the singer? Who is the beloved friend? Who is the bride? And who is the presence of Shabbat? That's perhaps too many questions, 4 questions. We already did that last month. So let's just narrow it down to 3, and we'll say the presence of the Sabbath, the Pnei Shabbat, is the same as the bride. But now let's go to the next slide, and we will begin to answer. So what I have to do before we can even begin to analyze this song is give it my standing on one leg introduction to Jewish mysticism. And here you can look at the Sfirot diagram that was sent out as part of the handout, or you can follow along on the screen, which we'll see in just a minute. Several key points to know about Jewish mysticism and mysticism in general. First of all, what mysticism is about is it's about transcending our earthly being, transcending the limitations of bodies that are finite, that age, that get sick, that die, and becoming, ultimately, going to the next step, becoming one, attaining a certain kind of mystical union in which we can participate in the life of divinity, participating in God's life, as it were. And it's not like we're going to be going into the control room, although to a certain extent it is. And we're going to be touching on the keys to try to have some kind of impact on God's own self. The way in which that takes place and the way in which God is conceptualized, and here you should take a look at that diagram, though we'll be able to, we'll look at it when we get to the next slide in just a moment, is the Kabbalists conceptualized God's transcendence, God's being above us in terms, but also having a way of bridging that gap through 10 sfirot, 10 gradations of divine manifestation, that there are going to be 10 stages through which God comes into the world and ultimately can bridge the distance between God's own self and our self. The way in which that is represented by the Kabbalists is as and here's a fancy word, a divine anthropos, meaning an anthropomorphic representation, represented as a human form. It's not to say that God has a body, but rather that the human being is the most complex metaphor that we have access to in this world. And so they used that metaphor to describe God. They think of the 10 sfirot as having masculine and feminine aspects. I'll show those to you when we go on to the next slide in a moment. And also that there's a vertical axis that runs through these different sfirot. Last important thing to know about in my standing on one leg introduction to Jewish mysticism is the centrality of divine names. That when you think of a proper name, so my name is Joel. If you were to see me in a crowd and you'd say, oh, there's that man, or there's that person. So you would all say like, oh, okay, I see that person. I see that man. I see that father. I see that son. But when you say, oh, I see Joel, then we know it's specifically that person. And there's a way in which, within the context, the parameters of language, the name then becomes identical to the thing itself. And we'll see how that's going to be relevant. For the moment, you can think about the concluding line of Aleinu that says, Bayom ahu yeh Adonai echadu shmo echadu. And on that day, God will be one and God's name will be one. That there is that within the parameters of language itself, there is an identity between a proper noun, which is a name, and the thing itself. And the most important name, of course, is the tetragrammaton, the yud and the hey and the vav and the hey, which, as you can see, I put dashes between because we can't erase that name, and we don't even pronounce that name because of its holiness. If we can go on to the next slide, and if you just look for just a moment at this slide, you can see how in the very center of this what's called a tree is a sphira, one of those 10 gradations called Tiferet. That axis, or that central hub of the sphirot around it, is considered to be the masculine aspect of divinity. And the very bottom, the one called Malchut, or Shekhinah, is considered to be the feminine aspect of divinity. Let's now turn to our hymn. So Julie, if we can go to the next slide, please. Who is the bride? In the Talmudic background is we have a teaching in the tractate of Shabbat 119a, in which Rabbi Hanina, named after my son, Miatef V'kaya Panya Damale Shabta. Rabbi Hanina would wrap himself in his garment and stand at nightfall on Shabbat Eve and say, come and we will go out to greet Shabbat the Queen. And then Rabbi Yanai put on his garments on Shabbat Eve and said, enter, O bride, enter, O bride, boi chala, boi chala. And here we get the basic building blocks that upon which we're going to get poems being written in the early modern period. But already we get these two very key metaphors of Shabbat as a queen and Shabbat as a bride. What's the effect of calling Shabbat a queen and Shabbat a bride? Is that it romanticizes Friday night. It romanticizes and even eroticizes the expectations that male Kabbalists and male rabbis and all of us curiously in different and not so curiously in different ways as we enter into Shabbat with its romance. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the first question that we need to answer is, who is the bride? And I've suggested that there are 4 different ways to answer this question. The first is in a spherotic sense. So again, if you look at your spherot diagrams, you'll see that who is the bride? It is the feminine presence down at the bottom of the spherotic tree called Malchut or Shekhinah, and that she is the one that we are having a romantic encounter, as it were, or a welcoming encounter with that aspect of divinity on Friday nights. The next possible coefficient of the bride, of the Kala, is Knesset Yisrael, the assembly of Israel, meaning the people of Israel. That there's a way in which perhaps this song that we're going to be looking at, we're singing to the nation. And we're singing to the nation in the 16th century when it's written by a Jew who's living in the land of Israel, and yet under Ottoman rule and with, not terribly oppressive, but somewhat oppressive measures without sovereignty, without independence. And that's an important theme to keep in mind. The Sphira of Shekhinah is also going to be considered to be somewhat suppressed, and we'll see how that plays itself out. Next is, in spatial terms, who is the bride? Is Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, and even the Temple Mount is considered to be the bride. There's a way in which this song is speaking to a geographic location that we're hoping will be raised up, and that's part of what the Kabbalists in 16th century Tzfat are anticipating, is a rising up of Jerusalem. And lastly, and this is perhaps the most obvious, is in temporal terms. Who is the bride? It is time itself, that there is a way in which time itself is transformed on Shabbat, the seventh day of the week. We're going to have time at the end for questions, so please write them down so you don't forget. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Who is the beloved, right? As we say, Lecha Dodi, is come my beloved, or my beloved friend. Who is it that we are singing to? So we are singing to Tiferet, that masculine aspect of divinity that I tried to draw attention to before, the one right in the center, the one that represents the large part of the spherotic tree. And who is the singer? Well, that's us, or that's the Kabbalist. Remember that for these people, that are originally writing these hymns and are singing them, we're talking about an elite group of male Kabbalists, whereas these days, this is a song that is universally sung, and we'll have to try and think about how can this be sung by people that are not male Kabbalists. The first step, and that's what I'll be helping with today, is getting you to the Kabbalist part. Let's go to the next slide, please. The refrain, number of repetitions and number of letters. So the accountants that are in the group are going to have a special advantage in this group, or math people, or maybe even some computer science and engineering people. But what I would like you to do is I'd like you to take a look at this refrain. This is what we're going to be singing. And before we count letters, is take a look at your handouts if you have them handy, and look at how many times we sing this as a refrain. When we first begin singing it, we sing it straight, and then it gets repeated. And it gets repeated after every stanza. How many repetitions? How many times is it sung as a refrain? It's sung 10 times as a chorus, as a refrain. It's no accident that it is sung 10 times, because there are 10 sphirot. So there's a way in which each one of these repetitions of this refrain is being sung as a way of addressing, of connecting to, of aspiring to, of reaching toward one of those sphirot. That there is an attempt for us to be having as intimate a relationship as possible through singing these, and you'll see that it's going to be much more direct. Okay, so for those of you that were math majors or have professional propensities, you've got the advantage. The rest of you can take out your calculators, look at the letters on the screen. I trust that we've got the refrain, number of repetitions screen up. I want you to count the letters. You've got 20 seconds. So at the risk of not having hundreds of people shout out, how many letters do we have here in total? Well, there are 26 letters in this refrain. What's significant about the number 26? 26 is the numerical equivalent of the divine name. It is, so if you can just go to the next slide for a moment, Julie. And it is the gematria of the yud and the hey and the vav and the hey of the tetragrammaton is 26. And the way in which that operated is that the yud equals 10, the hey equals 5, vav equals 6, hey equals 5, and we get to the number 26. And if you can just, so what we've got then in this refrain is that we are singing the numerical coefficient of God's name. And if we can go back to the previous slide for a moment, you'll notice the comma that's there. There are 15 letters before the comma. There are 11 letters after the comma. 15 corresponds to the yud and the hey, the first two letters of God's name. And the last 11 correspond to the vav and the hey, the 6 and the 5, which equals 11. So we've got 15 plus 11 equals 26. It means that 10 times it is as if what we are trying to do is sing God. It's as if we are trying, like Rav Yosef Karo, have God's own self come through our vocal cords. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, the one that says Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. We're going to begin to go through the stanzas. We're not going to go through all of the stanzas, but I want to draw attention to some of the most important themes or most interesting themes that we've got. So the first is Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. These are drawing on two different biblical verses, and you'll see that the order of the hymn of Shamor v'zachor is an inversion of the order of the biblical verses. Is that the verse from Deuteronomy, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, comes before remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. And in fact, in earlier versions by other authors, other poets of this hymn that were shorter, that had slightly different meters, they had it in the correct order. But Rav Shlomo Kabetz had his own reasoning for having it in this order: Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. Observe and remember in one utterance. What does that mean? Let's go on to the next. Actually, let's stick here for just one moment. In each of these two verses that are cited come from two different renditions of the Ten Commandments in the Torah. One is in Exodus, and the other is in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, it says, Zachor et Yom Shabbat l'kadsho. Remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. In Dvarim, in Deuteronomy, it says, Shamor et Yom Shabbat l'kadsho. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Well, couldn't Moshe keep it straight? Which one was it? And which one did God say? Did God say remember, or did God say observe? Let's see how the rabbis resolved the problem. This comes from the Talmud in Shavuot 20b. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy and observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy were spoken in one utterance, in a manner that the human mouth cannot say and that the human ear cannot hear. So what have the rabbis done is they've said, God's not like us. God can say two things at once, so that each one of those versions of the Ten Commandments is correct. Each literary version, each transcription, as it were, is providing a different set of information that was all somehow miraculously articulated at once. Now, for the Kabbalists, there's a slightly different meaning here. And what that is can be seen in the next slide. This is the slide that says Adonai Echad Ushmo Echad, that Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey is one, and his name is one. So the stanza says Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad hishmiyanu el miyuchad, that God caused us to hear it in one utterance. Adonai Echad Ushmo Echad. So I refer to that identity between name and person, or name and being at the beginning of the talk. For the Kabbalists, these two different elements, the Shamor v'Zachor, the keeping of the Sabbath, or the observing of the Sabbath, and the Zachor, the remembering of the Sabbath, correspond to the Yud He Vav and He, the being part of God, and the name, proper noun part of God. And what they are interested in is not merely the miracle of God being able to say two words at once, but rather that there is a mystical and erotic union of the masculine and feminine aspects of divinity. That's what occurred in the utterance of those two lines of the Ten Commandments. And that's what's occurring on Friday night, is that there is a romantic, loving union, a mystical union that occurs. And that's what we want to participate in. So Pete Townsend of The Who, in his great song Bargain, which sounds like a love song, but is actually a song, or like a love song that he's writing to a lover, a human lover, is actually a love song written to God. And he sings, one and one don't make one, they make one. That's part of what the mystical endeavor of Kabbalat, of Lecha Dodi is about, is that it is about that unification in which we can enjoy and participate in the unification of the masculine and the feminine, and of ourselves and of God. Let's move on to the next slide. Here we have, where we have the whole stanza, Shemor v'Zachor, B'dibur echad yishmianu el miuchad, Adonai echad u'shmo echad, l'shem, l'tiferet v'litila. So this is for name, for glory, and for praise that we are bringing about this unification. Let's move on. In the next stanza, Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelcha, to greet the Shabbat, let us go, for she is the source of blessing. From the very beginning, from antiquity, she was appointed, last in creation, first in thought. So the part of what's being talked about here is that in the same way in which an architect can imagine the building that she is designing from the get-go, and then she, creates the blueprint. First she makes sketches, and then she makes blueprints, and then you get the engineers involved, and then you get the politicians and the governance involved. But there's a way in which there was a vision that was there right from the very beginning. And it is that moment in time, that moment in space, that moment in the human being, and that moment in the Sfirot, all of those are what God's own initial thought was about, was how is this going to play out? And that's where what God's intention was towards at the very beginning. Let's go on to the next stanza, because here we begin to change the focus a little bit. Up until now, we've been talking largely in the temporal sense about Shabbat as, and about the bride as the seventh day of the week, as a representation of the holiness in time. But now we're moving into geographical territory. Mikdash Melech Ir Melucha, sanctuary or temple of the king, royal city, arise, come forth from the upheaval. So remember the perspective of these Kabbalists is that they are living in a situation in which they cannot go to the Temple Mount. They have a certain perspective of what they think that should be. We're not going to get into politics today. But from their perspective, there's a certain idealized notion of what the temple means. It is a place for the convergence of humanity with the deity, with divinity. And so when we are talking about Shabbat, there's a way in which Shabbat in time is identified with, is correlated with that temple. And they're talking about the way in which the land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, is somewhat, dusty and deserted. And while it's certainly not deserted, it is certainly lacking in glory. And the hope here is that God will be showing some of God's mercy. Let's move on to the next one. And I want to draw attention here to some of the pronounced Kabbalistic metaphors. The very first one is hitna'ari ma'afar kumi, is shake the dust off yourself. Arise, or hitna'ari, shake yourself off from the dust and arise. Again, we're speaking to Jerusalem, but we are also, and the Temple Mount, but we're also speaking to ourselves, to our own souls. We're speaking to the Jewish people. We are speaking to time itself. And we're talking about how what we need to do over the course of the week is to polish ourselves, at the end of the week, is polish ourselves up, is get the grime off, is try to get to the core of our spiritual being that's on the inside. And here the messianic theme becomes more pronounced when we say that it's through the son of Yishai, that was King David of Bethlehem, who is the son of Yishai. There is a pronounced hope at this time, and great deal of messianic fervor at that time, expressed through prayers and various kinds of ascetic exercises that the Kabbalists and Pietists were engaged in. Oh, and one other Kabbalistic, very important Kabbalistic metaphor, which says, "Livshi bigdei tifartecha mi," dress up in here they translate it as "your garments of glory, my people." But I think, and perhaps we'll leave it there, is that what are the garments of glory of the people? Is they are through the mitzvot that we perform, through the chesed that we perform, through the kindnesses that we perform for each other. That's moving along. Hitorari, wake up, or arouse yourself, or awaken. Is that there's a way in which we are all slumbering during the week, and there's a way in which we are hoping that time and history will waken things up for all of us at this time. In the interests of time, what I want to do is I'm going to skip this one, Lo Tevoshi, but and go to the next one that reads V'hayu limshisa shosayich. And Julie, I hope that you've been keeping up. I've got my own screen here, but hopefully you've been well cued. The next stanza reads, "V'hayu limshisa shosayich." They will be ravaged, those who ravaged you. Is that while most of us who are living here in the United States or in Canada, or I know that there's at least some of you in Israel, are living in relative security, and yet we are all aware of threats that are around us, and we are certainly aware of the threats that have ravaged the Jewish people in history, and that the poignancy of that loomed large for these Kabbalists, and they are in their feelings of oppression. They are calling for a certain kind of revenge, and while we may not necessarily be feeling quite those feelings, perhaps we can be empathetic to those who were suffering and might have felt that. And here we return to some of the romantic and erotic imagery when it says "Yasis alayich Elohayich," is that your God will rejoice over you. Over whom? Over the Shekhinah, over Jerusalem, over the Jewish people, and over time itself in Shabbat, as a groom does over a bride. Let's move on to the next one. In fact, which is Yaminu Smol Tifrotzi. And again, you see Al Yad Ish Ben Partzi, the man descended from Peretz. You'll recall that Peretz is the child that is born of the strange union of Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. which one would think is an incestuous union, but it was called for because of the deaths of his sons who were married to her. And in fact, the Messiah, according to tradition, comes about through a series of strange unions that we can't get into right now, but are either illicit or apparently lewd or promiscuous, or certainly troublesome and twisted. And there's a kind of an allusion to that it's hard to know exactly how redemption will come about, that things happen in strange ways. Let's turn now to the very last stanza. Boi v'shalom atzeret ba'ala, come in peace, crown of her husband. Gam berina uvitzahala. Most of you are probably used to singing gam besimcha uvitzahala, but we have Shlomo Alkabetz's original manuscript, and the correct version is actually rina rather than simcha. Toch emunei am segula, come with song and good cheer amidst the faithful of the treasured people. Boi chala, boi chala, boi chala Shabbat malkata. Now, for this stanza, what we do is that we turn around to sing. Now, that's sort of strange, right? Is that normally we are, those of us who are in North America, we turn towards the east, and much of Jewry through history would turn towards the east, which is where Israel, Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is. And yet, what happens at this point in the song is we turn around. Now, in most of the shuls that you've been to, people think, well, you turn around towards the door. Why? Because that's where the Sabbath bride is going to come in. That's where Shekhinah is going to come in. But hello, we said near the beginning of our discussion of this song that God can say two vastly different things at exactly the same time. So do we really need the Shekhinah to come in through a doorway? No. Silly. Why is it that we turn around? Is that we are now facing west. And why are we facing west? We're facing west because each of the four directions is also associated with different sphirot, different gradations of divinity. And the west, where the sun sets, is the one associated with Shekhinah. It's as if the sun, who's associated with Tiferet, the masculine aspect of divinity, that sun crosses across the horizon, and then at the end of the day, joins with the horizon in the west, which is where Shekhinah is. And so it is because of that symbolic association that we turn towards her. And so when I daven at my mom's shul in Toronto, and one of her rabbis I believe is here with us today, I was always the lone person that was turned towards the back of the room, and everybody else was turned towards the doorway. The doorway was in the north. I was turned towards the west. So if you now find yourselves turning in a different direction than everybody else, and they give you funny looks, you can explain to them that actually you're in the right. So that's what we've done now, is a kind of a whirlwind tour through through Kabbalat Shabbat, through Lecha Dodi, through the hymn, and we've seen that in many ways you can't understand this song without understanding its Kabbalistic underpinnings. And if you were only to walk away with one point, it would be this. That is that when we sing that refrain of Lecha Dodi with its 26 letters, that what we are actually trying to do is we are trying to divest ourselves of our egos, and so that God can enter, into our hearts, God can enter into our souls, and that then we can just speak God back and sing God back. And so that ultimately what we are doing is simply singing God. Thank you, and I'm happy to stick around for a while for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joel. I did not know that about facing west. Love that. So there were a few questions. I apologize if I missed any of them. So if I missed your question, please feel free to put it again in the chat. Someone asked about the word Lecha in Lecha Dodi. We translate it often as come bride, but doesn't Lech or Lecha mean go?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is something that has actually puzzled the etymologists to a certain extent. And so I'm going to skillfully duck the going into the details of that for the moment.
Okay, can you explain or review why Shamor and Zachor are feminine and masculine?
Yeah, that's a good question. And here we have to remember the patriarchal context, the male-centered or androcentric context that the Kabbalists occupy, their headspace. That in the Kabbalah, the word zachor, to remember, which is a positive action, is construed as a masculine action, and is associated, in other words, it's gendered masculine. Why is it gendered masculine? This actually goes back to the Greeks. How do you remember something? I said the same thing in my talk about Kiddush several weeks ago. How do you remember something in an ancient time? Is that you record it with a stylus, yeah, right? Or you mark it with a pen, and that there is a certain kind of maleness that they had in mind about what it means to record something, that you etch into something, that you mark something. And so that positive remembering was construed as masculine, associated with all the positive commandments. Keeping, shamor, guarding, is construed as a negative action, meaning to keep things at bay, make sure that things are properly are being properly kept, and so there are fences that get erected, and that is then associated with the feminine. So what happens then is it's not only that masculine and feminine aspects of divinity are being united, but all of the commandments as well, the positive and the negative commandments.
There was a discussion and a question about certain congregations, I think particularly Reformed congregations, that sing a selection of the verses, verses 1 to 5 and 9, in some places 1 to 8 and 9. Does this have to do, if you know, with the content of those verses, or is it just a time issue?
So that's a great question. One of the times when this also takes place is when Yom Tov goes into Shabbat, as we had, as we sometimes have, and then in some places they'll just sing the first two stanzas and the last two stanzas, and there are various reasons. When you look at different Siddurim, there's all kinds of reasons that people have. So I would actually want to take a close look before I speculated about it, but that could well be. It could be that there are people that are uncomfortable with the historical implications of imagining a restored Jerusalem. Most of us, I imagine, would not be longing for animal sacrifices in a restored Jerusalem, whatever a restored Jerusalem might look like in an idealized, some kind of idealized sense.
A couple people are asking about the two Shabbat candles and whether they also represent Shamor and Zachor.
Yeah, that's a great question, and they certainly do. I'm not sure that Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz had that in mind when he was writing it, although the guy had a lot in his head. The reason for thinking that it's probably not corresponding to the song is because of the hierarchy of the Shamor v'Zachor, and we're generally lighting two candles of the same size. But I think certainly for the rabbis who instituted the practice of lighting two Shabbos candles, that was part of it. And I think, and the other reason for lighting two candles, of course, is that you're adding light. Is that it would have been common, remember, before we had electricity, that you might have a candle in the evening. On Shabbat, you're going to have two. You're going to have a little bit more light.
What about, can you speak to the melodies that are used to sing Lecha Dodi, and when did they start, and how have they changed and grown?
That's a wonderful question. When I marched in graduation for my PhD at NYU in 1996, I marched with Dr. Mark Kligman, now Dr. Mark Kligman, professor of head of the music department at UCLA. And his area of specialty is Jewish music. And I urge you to write him and say, Joel Hecker said that I should write you. He's a friend of mine, and we marched together, 25 years ago. But I'm not a musician. I'm afraid I'm not up on the musicology there. Let me just answer one quick question I saw pop up. Is that somebody noticed that I've got God's name on the door behind me? And it's because that's East. So when I daven, when I pray here in my study, I use that as a kind of an icon. We're used to thinking about icons as being part of Catholicism or of Greek Orthodoxy, but there's a way in which Kabbalists used iconography of God's letters, of God's name, to and imagine them in different kinds of formation. And so, I mean, it's about, 8 feet behind me, 10 feet behind me, but they're pretty big letters, and they loom large. And there's a verse in Psalms that says, Shiviti Adonai Kenegdi Tamid. I have placed Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey in front of me always. So at least during my prayer, during my Shemona Esrei, I have those 4. And because the 4 letters of God's name are associated with the 10 Sfirot, very often in my mind, I will be thinking about the way in which God's blessings are flowing into me and the way in which I'm praying for them to flow into the world. Julie, I noticed that it's 1 o'clock, but I'm very happy to stay on to keep on answering questions.
Okay, thank you. I think there's just one more question or something that you could comment on, and then we'll close up. Thank you so much for the extra time. Someone is asking about the gendered nature of the hymn. At least one person commented that they have trouble, it feels sexist. Is there any other language that could be used besides for bride and queen that would be an alternative or an option?
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, I think that one of the challenges that modernity has, and it's a challenge that we are, continue to wrestle with, is we have we have changed social circumstances that change the way in which we view everything. And everything is in catch-up mode. And so, if we were to take Shakespeare and rewrite his plays in ways that would make them politically correct, then we would be in trouble. When I say that, I'm not critiquing the values underlying those impulses. What I'm saying is that Shakespeare, Lecha Dodi is Lecha Dodi. And so what we now need to do is we need to write new hymns, and we need to write new poetry, and we need when we're singing this is to be keeping in mind, well, what is the romantic relationship that I want to have with Shabbat? And because the Jewish tradition is a tradition of interpretation and of reinterpretation and of transvaluing. It is not one of contentment, as you can imagine. It is rather one of struggle in which people say, I don't buy this, or this doesn't speak to me. And Maimonides is the leader of that band. Maimonides said, you have to believe in these 13 things. And yet when you read even those 13 principles very carefully, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. And when you read his philosophical work, The Guide of the Perplexed, you see that oh no, he doesn't believe in the simple meaning of any of those. Well, maybe the first 2 or 3 talking about God in very metaphysical, philosophical terms. What he's engaged in is a vast transformation project of Judaism to make it make sense to him. And so what he models for us is ways of saying something and interpreting it in ways that make sense. So when I'm praying, for example, I'm not thinking in literalist terms about virtually any of the prayers. And even when I'm learning Torah, I'm thinking in symbolic terms. I'm thinking through many, many different lenses of interpretation and reinterpretation in order to allow what I imagine God's Torah must mean. Because if God, in fact, is accessible, and I believe God is, then there's got to be a way in which we can use the tools that we have, the Torah that we've received, and see through it. And what the Kabbalists talk about is peeling away layers to get to some kind of internal core of what God is actually about. And the very last point is I have several boys. My youngest is a 13-year-old, and about a month ago, he blew my mind when he said, well, God's just a metaphor. And the truth is that that's what the Kabbalah teaches, is that, and in fact, in some ways, it's what deconstructionism taught us, is that in many ways, we are living in a world of metaphors. So figure out the metaphors that will help you get there. Thanks so much, and wishing you all a transformed singing of Kabbalah of Lecha Dodi this week.